Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. Robbie Morgan is a lecturer and consultant here at the Idea Centre. In this conversation, we discussed Robbie's research into sexualisation. Unwanted sexualisation is at the very least an inappropriate behaviour. At worst, it can be an illegitimate exercise of power which involves harassing, bullying, or belittling another person. But how exactly should we define sexualisation, and what, if anything, is distinctively harmful about it? So, welcome, Robbie.
Thanks so much, Jim. I'm excited to be here.
So the first question I have is a simple one, and it's just, what, in your view, is sexualisation?
So in my view, broadly speaking, sexualisation is treating someone in a sexual way, or treating them as though they're a sexual entity. That's a slightly funny way of putting it, but the reason I say that is because there's a big literature around sexual objectification, which focuses on how people are treated as sexual objects. But I want to allow for the possibility that treating someone in a sexual way might not be treating them as an object. Even in those cases where we think something's wrong is going on, that language of objectification might not be the most helpful thing.
Okay, so you say there's a big literature on objectification. So have other people made this point that sexualisation is something slightly different from objectification, or are you the first person?
I'm not aware of other philosophers or writers who kind of make that point. The thing that took me in this direction was thinking of cases where you have, for example, an instance of sexual harassment, where one person says something sexual to another, but where it seems strange to say what they're doing is treating them as an object. So if one person says to another, for example, in an instance of street-based sexual harassment, if they were to say, I could show you a good time, that's sexualizing, it's sexual harassment, it's wrongful. There's something that seems slightly objectifying about it, but what's interesting is in that case, the perpetrator treats the person they target as though they have desires. They attribute desires to that person. Obviously, those aren't that person's actual desires, but they treat them as a being who is capable of wanting things for themselves, which isn't the sort of thing we'd say of an object. So that's why I kind of move away from an objectification paradigm towards sexualization more generally.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so if sexualization isn't just about objectification, then so what is it about? What are people doing if they're not objectifying?
Yes, thank you. So first I want to say what I'm focusing on here is specifically how people can sexualize each other in speech and those kinds of interactions or actions. I'm putting to one side, for example, how our art works. Pictures and so on might sexualize someone. I just think there's something slightly different going on there. So in my case, I make sense of sexualization by drawing on what Amy Alberting calls foregrounding and self-presentation. So Alberting's idea is that in all our interactions with others, we present ourselves in certain ways. There are certain aspects of ourselves that we present to others, and there are other aspects that we withhold from others. The ones that we present to other people are the aspects that we foreground, and the others are the ones that we background. And this is, I think, quite an intuitive and familiar idea. So we're having a conversation now, and we're foregrounding your property of being the interviewer, and my property of being the interviewee, and that's what's influencing the kind of conversation that we're having. That is how we make sense of what's going on here. Yes. And that happens in lots of formal and informal situations. When you have colleagues who are asking each other what they're up to over the weekend, there's a sense in which they're foregrounding for each other the property of them being friends or colleagues or acquaintances, or the property of being people who would have gotten up to something at the weekend, for example. Yeah. So this is supposed to be a fairly universal picture of how we interact with each other. There are certain things we want to be relevant to the conversation, and there's certain things that we want to withhold. Yes. And on my picture, sexualization consists in foregrounding the sexual properties of a person. So kind of making those properties salient to what's going on in that interaction. Okay, and how does one do that? How does one make certain things part of the foreground as opposed to the background? Yes, yeah. So on my picture, one person foregrounds a property of themselves or someone else by either commenting on it directly or by responding to it. What I mean by that is saying something that makes reference to that property, or saying something that only makes sense when we allow that a person has that property. So I draw a lot on one of Amy Olberding's examples, which she herself takes from a blog called What Is It Like to Be a Woman in Philosophy? And in that example, there's a philosopher who is at a conference that she's organised, and she's pregnant, and she describes a kind of really difficult and draining day at the conference where she's trying to talk with people about philosophy, but they keep asking her about her pregnancy, and how frustrating that is, that she's trying to talk about the thing she's there to do in a professional capacity, and yet she finds that those efforts are blocked. Yes. So in that case, what's going on is she's trying to foreground her property of being a philosopher at the conference. Yeah. But she's finding that that's backgrounded by other people. Other people aren't cooperating with her self-presentation, and they're instead foregrounding her pregnancy by commenting on it or by saying things that are related to that.
That's interesting. And so there's something going wrong there because the people who are foregrounding that property of her are not taking proper account of her wishes in terms of what should be foregrounded and backgrounded.
Yeah, that's precisely right. So she has what I would call, and what Olberding calls, a self-presentation, where she's foregrounding certain things about herself and backgrounding others, and other people aren't cooperating with that.
Right, okay, so presumably the particular properties that you're interested in the context of sexualization are sexual properties, right? So A sexualizes B if A foregrounds the sexual properties of B, whatever those turn out to be. But so how do you decide what are sexual properties as opposed to other kinds of properties?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So as I say, sexualizing someone involves foregrounding certain properties of themselves, but only some properties are going to sexualize someone. We're not sexualizing someone if we just foreground the fact that they're a colleague or something. Yeah. And pinning down what we want to count as a sexual property is really difficult. And in the philosophical literature, and I think much more broadly, people just can't agree on this. People can't find a definition of the sexual that accommodates everything we want to accommodate without bringing in stuff we don't want to count. Yeah. And that's made more complicated by the fact that people's sexual desires and sexual interests are just very diverse. So for my purposes, what I say is that a property is sexual if it involves the person's sexual desires or implicates them in the sexual desires of other people. So if one person says to another, I imagine that you enjoy X in a sexual way, or they imply that person is sexually attractive to others, or that other people would enjoy engaging in sexual contact with them, on my view, that's sufficient for it to be a sexual property. I don't myself yet have an account of what makes a desire sexual. It's something I'm very keen to explore further, but like I say, it's a bit of a sticky subject in philosophy. No one seems to be able to make any progress on this.
No pun intended.
Yeah, yes, no, absolutely not intended. Yeah. And so that's where I start with. So I say a property is sexual if it has to do with sexual desire.
Yeah.
But then it seems.
But it doesn't. Sorry to interrupt. So it's to do with sexual desire, but as you say, it's not necessarily actual sexual desires, it's kind of perceived sexual desires. So it counts as sexualization if somebody attributes sexual desires to somebody that they don't actually have.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So I have an example that I've been drawing on a lot in my writing about this, which I call business meeting. And this example is that Ashley has just started a job at a company, and she's in a meeting with her co-workers. A team of mostly men, and there's her manager, Bill, who's leading the meeting. And we imagine that Bill says, we're very pleased that Ashley's joining us today. Isn't she so pretty? I'm sure all the lads in the team are looking forward to getting to know her. Yeah. Somewhat of a paradigm case of workplace sexual harassment there. Yeah. And Bill does a few things there. He foregrounds some property of Ashley, namely the property of, according to him, being pretty or being perceived to be pretty by him, the properties of men in the team wanting to engage in sexual contact with her. Yeah. And he sexualizes Ashley because the properties he foregrounds are sexual. the property of other people wanting to engage in sexual contact with her is a sexual property. And of course, he also sexualizes the men in the team as well. He says that they have a particular sexual desire. And importantly, on my view, it makes no difference to whether this is sexualizing, whether any of this is true. It might be that no one there at all has any interest in engaging with sexual contact with each other. And that wouldn't make it any less sexualization, because there's still been a sexual property foregrounded, even if Ashley and the men there don't have that property at all.
Okay, good. That makes sense. So what is it that's particularly bad about doing that? I mean, it sounds like a stupid question in a way, like it seems that it's pretty obvious that there's something bad going on there, but what exactly is happening that's unethical?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's two stages to this. So the first one is why we might think that there's often something wrong with contradicting a person's self-presentation in any case, where they're presenting themselves in a certain way and that's being interfered with in some way. And then the second thing is, okay, there seem to be lots of cases where a person's self-presentation gets interrupted that might be bad, but why is sexualization different? Sure. So if we start by thinking about why it might be often wrong to contradict someone's self-presentation, I think there's two reasons. One is it really restricts a person's autonomy. When we present ourselves in a certain way, what we're doing is foregrounding certain properties of ourselves in order to try and guide our interactions with others. So if you imagine you're at work and you're trying to talk about a particular project that the team is involved in, and you're just talking to someone who just will not take what you're trying to say seriously, just keeps changing the subject to what's going on, after work and after work drinks and all the office gossip, that can be really frustrating. Yeah. And one way in which you might make sense of that being really frustrating is it really restricts a person's freedom to kind of get done what they want to do and to pursue their projects and so on. And the reason for that is we foreground and background certain properties of ourselves in order to try and influence our interactions with others. And we often need to do that in order to get what we want out of our interactions with others. Yeah. And when someone isn't cooperating with that, it makes it very difficult for us to do what we're trying to do. Another example that I talk about a lot in this context is we imagine a waiter who's been on their feet for a while, trying to take this customer's order, and this customer just takes the opportunity to waffle on at length about everything they've been through and their family woes and their money troubles and all their everything they're going through and how difficult it is. Yeah. And that's contradicting the waiter's self-presentation, because the waiter is trying to do their job, they're trying to foreground their role as a waiter, and this customer just isn't having any of it. They're not allowing them to just take their order and do their job. Yeah. And that's frustrating because it means the waiter can't achieve what she's trying to achieve in doing her job. Yeah. So one reason that contradicting a person's self-presentation is really problematic is that it reduces a person's autonomy, sure, in a sense, with regard to their interactions with others. Yes. And the second reason, I think, is that it instrumentalizes them. So this is a concept that I take from the literature on the sexual objectification. Martha Nussbaum, in her work on objectification, talks about this quite a lot. So to instrumentalize someone is sort of to use them for one's own purposes, where we might allow for a stronger version of instrumentalization, where that involves treating someone as a tool for one's own purposes without due regard for their own interests and goals and preferences and so on. And we might think that when a person's self-presentation is contradicted, especially without good reason, that's kind of exactly what's happening. Because if I'm contradicting a person's self-presentation, I'm foregrounding whatever properties of that person it's useful to me to foreground, yes, and I'm not really paying attention to what they need or what they prefer in that interaction. Yes. So an example I use in this context is, imagine that I'm talking to someone and I've heard a rumor about them, a really juicy rumor that I'd really like to know more about. I can do two things, and I know that would embarrass them. I know that's something they want to background. Yeah. I can do two things. I can either respect their self-presentation, in which case I take seriously their own preferences and interests in realizing that they have their own interests and I don't want to impede on that, yeah, or I can contradict their self-presentation and I can foreground this juicy gossip that I've heard, in which case that fulfills my interest and my preference in knowing about them, but I instrumentalize them because I use them for what I need, without being fair to them, without taking in properly into regard their own preferences and their own interests.
Right, okay, good. So that sort of leads into one question which I wanted to ask, which is kind of, and I think you cover this in the paper, but that there must be kind of background normative conditions, what philosophers call normative conditions, but basically the ethics of the situation, I suppose, that play a part in whether and to what extent treating somebody in this kind of way is wrong, right?
Yeah.
So there must be cases where one person will be foregrounding aspects of another person which they would rather be backgrounded, but they're not wronging them by doing that.
Yes.
So I think about cases like, you know, a politician who might not really want to talk about the implications of their economic plan right now, but it's completely legitimate for the political interviewer or whatever to be wanting to bring those things up. And actually that there might be cases even of sexualisation where it's legitimate to foreground someone's sexual properties even if they don't want you to. I suppose there might be politician cases like that, right? So a politician's run on a kind of back to basics, family values platform, and they've got some kind of, you know, sexual shenanigans in their private life that they'd rather not be mentioned. But it seems like, at least arguably, it's legitimate to be foregrounding those even against the wishes of the person.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And we can imagine cases in which actually it's not only permissible to contradict a person's self-presentation, but where it might be something we have a duty to do. Yeah. So, for example, a journalist who is interviewing a politician but just takes that politician at face value with everything they're saying and, you know, giving utter deference to their self-presentation is doing something wrong. Yeah. So there's certainly cases in which it is permissible and perhaps we might think obligatory to contradict a person's self-presentation. And then the question is, okay, so how do we make sense of what those cases are and how does this work? So there's, I think, roughly two models that we might draw on to make sense of this. So one is to say that everyone has a kind of prima facie moral claim to having their self-presentation respected. Yeah. So what I mean by that is, by moral claim, I mean sort of like a right, but less stringent than that. So there's a moral reason to cooperate with a person's self-presentation for the reasons we were talking about earlier around autonomy and instrumentalization and so on. But that claim can be outweighed. It's a prima facie claim. If there are good reasons to contradict a person's self-presentation, then that outweighs any claim they have to have it respected. So that seems to be what's going, or that's one interpretation of the politician case. It might be that we think everyone has a general claim to have their self-presentation respected, but in the politician case, there's really strong reasons not to do that. Yeah. And those reasons just outweigh any reason to respect.
That makes sense. So if you think that what's going wrong is somebody's autonomy is being interfered with, well, we don't typically think of autonomy as an absolute right. You know, we do think that there are ways in which someone's right to autonomy is less than absolute, and there might be legitimate kind of limits on that.
Yes, exactly. So there are kind of lots of things that work like this. Yeah. And often that's what will happen when we think, you know, if we have a certain resource, say government's deciding how to distribute resources, and they might think, okay, these different people have different claims, you have to have a way of weighing them up. So that's something that happens kind of quite a lot. On the other hand, we might think that that's still too generous to say the politician who's been corrupt, you know, it might be giving too much to them. Because we might say, in that case, it's not that they have a claim to self-presentation that is just outweighed. You know, they still have that claim, but it gets outweighed by more important considerations. We might think, in that case, they don't have a claim at all, because they've done something wrong, and in particular, contradicting their self-presentation is necessary to hold them accountable. And when I've been thinking about this, I've been drawing a bit on some discussions in the philosophy of criminal punishment, where the idea there is, often in a much more serious context, the idea is we have general rights against, you know, being imprisoned or being fined, something like that, but we have to make sense of, therefore, how it could be permissible for someone to face criminal punishment, i.e., how do they not have those rights anymore? Yeah. And one view that comes out of that literature is to say, well, those rights have been forfeited. because of their wrongdoing, their serious wrongdoing, they no longer have a right against certain forms of punishment. Yeah. And we might make a similar move in the case of the corrupt politician and say, okay, usually people have a moral claim to have their self-presentation respected, but in the case of that politician, they've just forfeited that claim. They just don't have that moral claim or that right anymore because they've done something wrong. And to kind of draw back to something you said in your question, I think there are possible cases of that in the sexualization context. So if we imagine that there are two people who are monogamous in a relationship together, and one of them has cheated and the other finds out about that, the person who's been cheated on is completely within their moral rights to continually raise this with the person who was cheated and to, in a sense, hold them accountable for that transgression. The person who's cheated might not want that to happen. It might be part of their self-presentation that they want to background their bad behaviour and foreground anything else at that point. But of course, the person, that their partner isn't doing something wrong by contradicting their self-presentation. And we might say in that case, that's because the cheating partner has kind of forfeited their claim on having their self-presentation respected. There'd be something almost absurd about them saying, oh no, I'm presenting myself in this way and I want that to be respected. That would be kind of slightly ridiculous. Right. So we might think they've just, although generally people have a claim to have their self-presentation respected, it's just been forfeited in that kind of case.
Okay. Another question I had is about what's distinctive about sexualization. So in some of the cases that you've been discussing, I don't know, it sort of intuitively feels like there's something particularly egregious about the cases that cover sexualization as opposed to the foregrounding of other properties that people would rather keep in the background. So, I mean, the case of the pregnant philosopher, that seems pretty bad, like that person wasn't able to kind of go about their work as a philosopher because people kept referring to their pregnancy. But isn't there something just particularly awful about the kinds of cases where somebody is being sexualized in a work context and people are saying things like, I'm sure all the boys here would, all that kind of stuff. That seems particularly bad. So is there something particularly egregious about sexualization cases?
Yes, so I think there is. So I think when we're talking unwanted sexualization, there's something going on that isn't going on in at least some or many other cases where a person's self-presentation is contradicted. And my explanation from that involves a sort of a bundle of considerations that I think broadly relate to the way in which sex in general is treated by societies and particular aspects of kind of practices of unwanted sexualization. Mm-hmm. So one of the big things I think influences this is the fact that we treat sex as very private. And I'm sure that's less true now than it has been at many points in history, but nevertheless, there's various ways in which sex is treated as something that happens behind closed doors. Yeah. And there's an awful lot, interestingly, of cross-cultural consistency in that matter, actually. It's one of those things that as much as kind of sexual practices might differ in different cultures, actually the fact that it's generally or overwhelmingly not performed in public or in front of parties who aren't involved is actually very, very consistent cross-culturally.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, sorry, Craven.
And I think that then can help us say something about the wrongness of unwanted sexualization.
Yeah.
And this links into what I said before about autonomy and instrumentalization. Yeah. So it's in unwanted sexualization, it's not just that a person is made unfree in terms of which parts of themselves to present to the world and which to withhold. It's that their autonomy is restricted to the extent that even something as private as sex, they're not allowed to, or they're not able to withhold from others. Even something so that we think of as so intimate is almost broadcast to whoever's around, or even if it's just two people in a conversation. So the privacy and intimacy of sex seems to make a difference there.
So that was interesting what you were saying about this being quite consistent across cultures, because what probably isn't so consistent across cultures is how bad people think sexualization is. Right?
Yes.
So actually there probably are some cultures in which talking about other people in a sexual way, even at work, isn't thought of as being that bad.
Yes. Yeah.
So does your account say, is an implication of your account that sexualization, even in those cultures where it's kind of thought of as being more permissible, is just as bad as it is in cultures where it's frowned on or more taboo?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I don't think I'm committed to a kind of hard and fast answer of how we weigh those things up, or exactly in what circumstances it's going to be worse than others. And that's kind of deliberate, because I want to allow that part of what my concept of sexualization is doing is capturing a really diverse range of phenomena. And there's, I think, loads of reasons that we might think that unwanted sexualization can be more or less serious depending on a massive range of factors that relate to the context in which it occurs and the people involved and so on. So, for example, another factor that I've had in mind that I think makes unwanted sexualization more seriously wrong than many other cases of contradicting a person's self-presentation is that unwanted sexualization is often threatening. So this is something that comes up a lot in testimony, particularly from women who've been subjected to street-based sexual harassment, is that there's a threat there that might continue, or that the harassment might lead to physical or sexual violence. Right, and that's something that maybe is much less present in cases of other cases of contradicting a person's self-presentation, perhaps. So that's one reason I think that unwanted sexualization is often worse, and I think, again, that's something that will vary depending on the context, because there just will be certain cases of unwanted sexualization that are more threatening than others. Right. So that's just kind of one of the features I have in mind when we're kind of have a conversation about the diversity of these cases in terms of how we might think about that.
Yeah, and I suppose another kind of aspect of this is sort of short of a threat of violence, there might still be a kind of exercise of power going on.
Yes.
So by sexualizing somebody, you're kind of demonstrating that you can bring into light certain things that they want to be kept private. So you're kind of demonstrating that you don't need to respect their private, and therefore you're sort of asserting your power over them. So then there's a kind of element of power dynamics going on.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. And I think thinking about the kinds of examples we've spoken about of contradicting a person's self-presentation in general, I think that's often true. Yeah. This is often kind of something that happens by someone who's in a position of power towards someone who isn't. And I think that's particularly true in cases of sexualization, where we have, for example, the business meeting case we were talking about before. And what's really striking about these cases is it's not just one person is demonstrating their power over another. It's, again, that they're doing it in relation to something that's deeply private and intimate. It's not just the message communicated isn't just this person has power over this person. It's that this person has the power to make salient or reference or comment on or draw to the fore something about this person that's really private and intimate. Yes. And I think that can be part of why unwanted sexualization in particular feels like such a violation. It is that kind of, it's crossing a really strict boundary in a way that really disrespects the person there.
And I suppose that probably also starts to make sense of why we might think that cases of sexualization are in some ways worse if directed from someone who's a member of a group with particular level of power within society towards somebody who's part of a group that has less power. So.
Yes, precisely. So I've been thinking about this in terms of how unwanted sexualization can be a form of discrimination. And part of what prompted that was looking at some empirical work and fairly recent reports, especially in light of the kind of Me Too campaign a few years ago, which found in general that members of certain ethnic minorities and LGBT people and women and disabled people were much likely to be subjected to unwanted sexualization in general than people who don't belong to those groups. So we might from there be able to draw out a more general phenomenon that people who belong to socially marginalized groups or groups that have at least traditionally been disempowered are more likely to be subject to unwanted sexualization. So then I think we can make sense of this idea that unwanted sexualization seems to be in itself a kind of discrimination. It seems as though what's happening is people are targeted on the basis of the fact that they belong to a marginalized group. Yeah. And I think that has a real impact. It's wrong in itself in that we think unjust discrimination is wrong in itself. But I think it also impacts the dynamics of unwanted sexualization in terms of the act that's occurring, because it means that certain messages get sent. So one thing that you often hear when people are talking about having their self-presentation contradicted in general, and particularly in unwanted sexualization, is that what unwanted sexualization implies is that a person is somehow not qualified to do the role that they're trying to foreground. So the idea here is that if somebody is, say, in a business meeting and they're trying to be there as a business person, that's the property they're foregrounding, that's what they're there to do, and then they're subjected to unwanted sexualization, one thing that's happening is the person who's sexualizing them is saying, no, I'm not going to respect your role that you're instantiating as a business person. I'm instead going to attribute this sexual property to you and focus on that instead. So it's not only that something really private is being brought to the fore in a way that's a violation, it's also that the thing that this person is trying to do is being backgrounded against their will. They're being prevented from carrying out this role. And in the case of unwanted sexualization that's targeting a member of a marginalized group, we might think that the message that's conveyed by that act is a more general discriminatory one. So to kind of make this more straightforward, let's imagine it's a case where a man is subjecting a woman to unwanted sexualization, and that's in a business context. So when that man sexualizes that woman, not only is he sort of communicating that he doesn't respect her in the role that she's trying to foreground, we might also think, given traditional sexist stereotypes and ideologies according to which women's sexual properties have been emphasized over their professional contributions, we might think that what that man is doing is also communicating the message that women in general ought not to have their professional identity respected, or that women's sexual properties or even perceived sexual properties ought to be emphasized over those professional properties. So when we look at how this operates as a kind of discrimination, we see that, I think, on the individual level of one person is discriminating against another, but also the messages that get conveyed there, I think, are much more general.
Yes, okay, so it kind of giving the message that members of that group in general ought to have their sexual properties foregrounded, that those sexual properties are kind of fair game.
Yes.
And by doing that, you're entrenching discrimination against those people.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And in addition, ought to have the properties they're trying to background, because that's the flip side of this. It's not only that something is foregrounded against someone's will, it's also that they're prevented from engaging in that interaction in the way that they want to.
Right, okay. I just have one more question then. So it was something that strikes me as kind of interesting about this account, which is that it's very kind of social, and it's all to do with the way people interact with each other.
Yes.
And that seems right, and that seems to identify some of the really important moral properties of what's going on here. But I just wondered, is your account able to make sense of a case where somebody's sexualizing somebody else without the other person even knowing about it, or without anybody knowing about it? So what if, two people are having a business meeting and one of them is thinking about the other one in a sexual way while having the conversation, but it's not influencing the conversation in any way, it's just something that's going on in the mind of the sexualizer.
Yes.
Is that still sexualization? Is it still wrong? And how does your account make sense of that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question, and I think it's one actually that we might chart as going back to, I think it was Rousseau who said something about this. I think he kind of had the idea that what he says was it's wrong to sexually fantasize about someone when they don't know, almost for reasons of consent and so on. I might have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure this kind of idea goes back at least as far as Rousseau. And I think, my account will struggle, I think, to say too much about this. I think there's ways in which we can use the resources of my account and apply them in that context. So, for example, one of the things I've said is that unwanted sexualization wrongs someone by contradicting their self-presentation, and that is bad in part because it interferes with their autonomy, for example. And we might think that something comparable is going on in the case you've described, where a person is trying to present themselves in a certain way, or is presenting them in a certain way. They seem to be succeeding. Unbeknownst to them, in the mind of the person they're talking to, that self-presentation isn't being fully cooperated with or respected. And we can imagine that that has certain consequences, intended or unintended, on the part of the person who's doing that imagining, because it might lead them to take the person they're talking to, the person they're mentally sexualizing, less seriously in their professional capacity. Again, at least psychologically, we might think they're sort of foregrounding a sexual aspect of that person at the expense of paying proper attention to their professional attributes. And that might lead them to take that person less seriously, interfere with that person's autonomy. Yes. So I think there's a parallel story we can tell, but I also think it raises further questions that my account can't directly deal with. So, for example, if those people aren't in the same room and it's just one colleague is fantasizing about another, what we want to say about that, and I don't think my account gives an answer either way in that kind of case.
I suppose, in a way, you could say it's interfering with the person's autonomy insofar as that autonomy requires that everybody that they're interacting with takes proper account of which properties they want to be foregrounded and which ones they want to be backgrounded. So even if it's just that one individual and it's not influencing the kind of wider social situation, there's that autonomy maybe still being interfered with to that extent?
Yes, yeah. So I think I say in response to that, and this goes back to something you were saying before about how autonomy isn't absolute. Yeah. And I worry that might be trying to make a bit too much of what we want from autonomy, if that extends to how we're perceived by other people. Right. So I think it's an interesting question that I'm interested to explore more. And I think there might be different frameworks that can help get us there. I'm not sure that autonomy is going to get us far enough in that direction.
Great. Maybe a follow-up paper.
Maybe.
Great. All right. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Robbie Morgan.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.